All right, so today we're going to do a deep dive into the potential impacts of a second Trump term, specifically what his plans are for some key policy areas. He won the 2024 election in the middle of all this economic uncertainty, but he's been kind of vague on specifics, like what is he actually going to do?
Well, the interesting thing is we actually have some clues. We can look at his campaign rhetoric and his actions from his first term, obviously. And then there's this really intriguing policy blueprint called Project 2025. It's from the Heritage Foundation. And it basically lays out a conservative wish list for a second Trump administration.
Yeah, so even though Trump himself has said he hasn't read Project 2025, a lot of what's in it seems to line up with what he was saying on the campaign trail. So is it something we should be paying attention to?
I think it's definitely worth considering. Even if you think you know what to expect from a second Trump term, the details in some of these proposals are pretty eye-opening, no matter where you stand politically.
Okay, so let's start with something that's been a huge focus in American politics: abortion. No, Trump is taking credit for overturning Roe v. Wade, thanks to his Supreme Court appointments. But his stance on a federal abortion ban has been kind of inconsistent, hasn't it?
Yeah, it really has. On one hand, he said a federal ban is unnecessary because it's back in the hands of the states now. But then he also said he'd uphold Florida's 6-week ban, which, remember, most Floridians actually voted against.
So even if he doesn't push for a ban himself, his influence is going to be felt one way or another.
Absolutely. I mean, the people he appoints, the judges, he confirms. And who he listens to, it's all going to have a huge impact on how this plays out across the country.
Okay, so moving on to the economy. We all know economic worries played a big role in Trump's win. He presented himself as like the fixer,
Right.
even though when he came into office the first time, the economy was already recovering. And a big part of his fix seems to be taxes.
Yeah, and there's this big question mark hanging over. What happens to his 2017 tax cuts? Because parts of those included the expanded child tax credit. They expire in 2025, so will he extend them? His running mate, J.D. Vance, even suggested going bigger with like a $5,000 child tax credit.
Wow, $5,000. That's a pretty significant increase. And then there's all these other tax breaks he's talked about on tips on overtime pay, even on Social Security benefits. I mean, I know tax cuts sound good to a lot of people, but what would that actually mean for everyday workers?
Well, let's look at the tax cut on tips, for example. It might sound really appealing, but a lot of tipped workers don't even make enough to pay federal income tax in the first place. So a tax cut on tips might only save them a few dollars a week, while at the same time reducing Social Security revenue by billions of dollars a year.
So you're saying it might actually benefit business owners more than workers?
It's definitely a possibility worth considering. And when it comes to Social Security, cutting taxes on things like tips and overtime, it means less revenue going into a system that's already facing long-term challenges
Yeah.
and could potentially make those problems even worse.
Okay, so we've got potential impacts on abortion access, major changes to the tax system. And now let's talk about LGBTQ plus rights, specifically trans rights. Trump's campaign was incredibly aggressive on this, and his proposals seem to go way beyond what we saw in his first term.
Yeah, this is actually one area where Trump's agenda seems to diverge from what most Americans prioritize. Because if you look at the polls, things like the economy and healthcare always rank way higher than transgender issues.
And yet so much of his campaign messaging focused on exactly that. And it wasn't just rhetoric, was it?
No, not at all. He's got some very specific proposals out there. We're talking about defunding hospitals that provide gender-affirming care to trans youth, potentially targeting teachers who support trans students, and even putting a complete federal halt on funding for gender-affirming care at any age. This goes way beyond the debates about trans athletes in sports that we've been hearing.
So it sounds like some of these proposals could face some serious legal challenges.
I think that's very likely. A lot of legal experts have already said they might violate existing anti-discrimination laws. But even if they fail in court, just the fact that they're being proposed creates this climate of fear and uncertainty for the trans community.
Okay, let's switch gears and talk about education. Trump has said he wants to dismantle the Department of Education, which could have huge implications for students. And of course, school choice is a big part of his agenda, which sounds appealing to a lot of parents, but Project 2025 seems to take this a step further.
What's interesting here is how they connect school choice to a much broader cultural agenda. They talk about potentially gutting LGBTQ plus student protections and targeting what they see as progressive curriculum. So it's not just about funding mechanisms. It's about shaping what's actually taught in schools and what kind of environment students are exposed to.
And we saw what happened during Trump's first term with Betsy DeVos as education secretary. She rolled back protections for trans students, especially when it came to sports. and made it harder for survivors of sexual assault to report and seek justice.
Exactly, and those policies had very real impacts on people's lives. So we could see a return to those DeVos-era policies, and potentially even an expansion of them. And, dismantling the Department of Education doesn't just affect LGBTQ plus students. Students with disabilities who rely on the department to enforce their right to an inclusive and appropriate education. They could be hit hard, too.
It sounds like there's a lot at stake here. Now, another issue that was central to Trump's campaign, just like in 2016, is immigration. His rhetoric was harsh, calling for the largest deportation ever. But how would he actually do that?
Well, Project 2025 offers some clues. They want to reinstate all of his previous immigration rules, including the controversial Remain in Mexico policy, which forced asylum seekers to wait in Mexico, while their cases were processed here in the U.S. They also want to make it harder for undocumented students to attend college.
And how would they do that?
They're talking about denying them access to federal loans and even punishing schools that offer in-state tuition rates to undocumented students.
And how many states currently have those policies in place?
Right now, nearly 20 states allow undocumented students to pay in-state tuition. So this would be a pretty big shift in how a lot of states approach this issue. And it could make college a lot more difficult for undocumented students.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground already, but we need to talk about another group that could be profoundly impacted by a second Trump term: disabled and older Americans. One of the biggest concerns here is what happens to the Affordable Care Act, which Trump has repeatedly vowed to replace.
This is huge because millions of Americans rely on the ACA for health coverage, including people with pre-existing conditions who were denied coverage before. And let's not forget about Medicaid, which is a lifeline for millions of low-income Americans, including a lot of disabled and older people who rely on it for long-term care.
And it seems like Trump has a history of trying to cut Medicaid funding, right?
He does. And his relative silence on protecting Medicaid this time around is concerning, to say the least. What's especially worrying is that Medicaid funds the majority of long-term care in this country. Without it, a lot of families just wouldn't be able to afford the care their loved ones need.
And speaking of costs, let's not forget about drug prices. Biden made some progress on this front by allowing Medicare to negotiate drug prices for the first time. Trump promised to do this back in 2016, but never did. Will he make it a priority this time around? And what about his proposal for a caregiver tax credit? Is that even enough to make a dent in these skyrocketing costs of care?
Yeah, that caregiver tax credit is interesting. I mean, any financial assistance for caregivers is great. But the proposed amount of $5,000 to $6,000 a year, it's nothing compared to the actual costs of care.
So it wouldn't really help families struggling with those costs.
It would provide some relief,
Yeah.
but it's not a real solution. I mean, the average annual cost of home care is over $40,000. And a shared room in a nursing home can cost over $100,000 a year. So while a tax credit might help some families, it's not going to solve the bigger problem.
And it raises the question of where does the rest of that funding come from?
Exactly. Will families be expected to shoulder the burden? Will we see further cuts to Medicaid? These are all questions that need to be addressed. And finally, we come to climate change, which is an issue where Trump's agenda really diverges from global trends. While the rest of the world is working to reduce emissions and transition to clean energy, Trump seems to be sticking with fossil fuels.
Yeah, he does seem to be going against the grain here. Scientists are warning about how urgent it is to address climate change, and yet he's talking about expanding oil and gas production.
Yeah, it's a stark contrast to what most developed countries are doing. Remember, during his first term, he pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement, rolled back environmental regulations, basically gutted the EPA.
He even went so far as to remove mentions of climate change from government websites. It was like he was trying to pretend it wasn't happening.
And now, Project 2025 is laying out plans to basically undo any progress that's been made since then. They're talking about gutting the EPA even further, rolling back Biden's clean energy initiatives, and even retracting foreign aid that's meant to help other countries deal with climate change.
So it's not just about ignoring the problem here at home. It's about actively undermining global efforts to address it. What kind of message does that send to the rest of the world?
Well, I mean, the U.S. withdrawing from the Paris Agreement was a major setback the first time around. Now, with Trump back in office and pushing this pro-fossil fuel agenda, it raises serious questions about whether America is really committed to global climate action.
And what about the consequences for us here in the U.S.? We're already seeing the effects of climate change: extreme weather, rising sea levels, droughts, wildfires. How are those things going to be affected if we keep going down this path?
Well, the science is very clear. If we don't significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions, The impacts of climate change are just going to get worse. More frequent and severe heat waves, droughts, floods, hurricanes. Sea levels will continue rising, displacing millions of people. Food security could even be threatened.
It's a pretty bleak picture. It feels like we're moving backward when we should be moving forward. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. Abortion access, the economy, LGBTQ plus rights, education, immigration, care for disabled and older Americans, and climate change. It's a lot to think about, and I know it can feel overwhelming, especially when you consider what all of this could actually mean.
You're right, it is a lot to take in. But remember, the goal here isn't to overwhelm you, it's to empower you. We've given you a lot of information.
Yeah.
But it's ultimately up to you to decide what you do with it.
Exactly. This deep dive wasn't about predicting the future. It was about giving you the tools to understand what a second Trump term might look like, based on the information we have. And the most important thing you can do now is stay engaged, stay informed, and use your voice to advocate for the things you believe in.
Absolutely. Democracy is an ongoing process, and it requires participation from all of us, whether that's voting, contacting your representatives, organizing in your community, or even just talking to your friends and family about these issues. Your voice matters.
Yeah.
Don't underestimate the power you have to make a difference.
And here's something else to think about. We've talked a lot about policy, but what about the broader cultural impact of this agenda? How might it affect how we talk to each other, how we engage in activism, how people feel about the future? Those are some pretty big questions.
They are. Policy doesn't exist in a vacuum. It shapes and is shaped by our cultural context and the rhetoric we saw during this election. The focus on certain issues and how those issues were framed, that's all going to have a lasting impact on how we view ourselves as a society.
That's a great point. And on that note, I think it's important for all of us to keep exploring, keep questioning, keep learning. There are so many resources out there, from news sources to academic research to the experiences of people who are directly affected by these issues. The more informed you are, the better equipped you'll be to navigate these times and to create a future that aligns with your values.
We live in a complex world, and there are very rarely easy answers. But by considering different viewpoints, seeking out reliable information, and just thinking critically about the choices in front of us, we can create a future that benefits everyone.
Well said. So to all of you listening, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's been informative and thought-provoking, and maybe even a little inspiring.
And remember, stay curious, stay engaged, and never give up hope.
You know, as we've been talking about all these potential changes and challenges, it's easy to feel kind of overwhelmed. But looking back at all the source material, I'm also struck by how much potential there is for resistance and pushback against some of these proposals.
Right, and we saw massive protests and legal challenges during Trump's first term. And I think we could stick even more this time around, especially on issues like abortion and LGBTQ plus rights. There's a whole network of advocacy groups, legal organizations, grassroots movements, all ready to fight to protect the rights and freedoms that are at stake.
So it's not like these policies would just be implemented without a fight.
Absolutely not. And don't forget about the power of the vote. You know, midterm elections are coming up in 2026, and that's going to be a crucial moment for people to make their voices heard. Who controls Congress will have a huge impact on whether Trump can actually put this agenda into action.
Yeah, that's a good reminder. And it's also important to remember that public opinion is complex. Even on issues like abortion, where there are these strong divisions, there's a lot of nuance there. And as we've seen with things like the fight for marriage equality, public opinion can and does shift over time.
Exactly. Change is rarely a straight line. There will be setbacks, there will be challenges, but I do think there's reason to believe that progress is possible, even when things feel really daunting.
I think this deep dive has been admittedly pretty heavy. We've explored some potentially concerning aspects of what a second Trump term might bring. But it's important to remember that the future isn't set in stone.
We all have a role to play in shaping it. That's something we shouldn't forget.
This deep dive wasn't about predicting the future. It was about giving you the tools to understand what a second Trump term might look like. And now it's up to all of us to stay informed, stay engaged, and use our voices to advocate for what we believe in.
We've given you a lot to consider, but ultimately it's about what you take away from this information. What resonates with you? What questions do you still have? That's where the real deep dive begins, your own exploration and critical thinking.
And on that note, we encourage you to keep digging, keep questioning, keep learning, engage with different perspectives, seek out reliable information, and think critically about the choices we face, both individually and as a society.
We can't predict the future,
Huh?
but we can certainly prepare for it. And the best way to do that is by being informed, engaged, and empowered to make a difference.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you some food for thought and maybe even a little fire in your belly to get out there and shape the future you want to see.
Remember, the future is not something that just happens to us. It's something we create together.